The axe fell hard against the block of wood, splitting it cleanly in two. Rafn, the thrall, no longer had tears left as he stared down Jarl Thorvald, the man who had condemned both his father and himself to execution at dawn. "My father is innocent," he whispered, his voice trembling. "For the honor of your ancestors, reconsider." The Jarl only smiled, his eyes cold like the winter sea. "The decision stands. Make the most of your last hours, Thrall. Thank you for being here and sharing this story. This channel is just starting its journey, and every subscription truly means the world to us. It helps keep this project alive and growing as we aim for our first 1,000 followers. If you enjoy this tale, please consider subscribing and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Your support makes all the difference. The first rays of dawn crept cautiously over the jagged peaks surrounding the fjord, casting a pale light upon the village of Ravnholm. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the unmistakable scent of salt and seaweed from the restless waters below. A mist hung low over the thatched roofs, muffling the usual morning clamor of the settlement. Within his cramped corner of the thrall's cabin, Rafn stirred awake, the rough, hand-woven wool of his blanket prickling at his skin. The chill of the early morning seeped into his bones, making his breath visible as soft clouds before him. He was 19 winters old, a slender figure marked by hardship and labor. His long, dark brown hair tangled in knots, framing a face that bore the duality of youth and weariness. His pale skin, marred by scars and the faint red lines of past lashes, told silent stories that no words could fully express. The iron ring heavy around his neck was a constant reminder of his fate. A thrall, bound by chains not just of metal but of circumstance. Outside, the faint crackling of fires being stoked rose from the kitchens and blacksmith's forge. The rhythmic clinking of hammer on anvil punctuated the stillness, a steady heartbeat keeping the village alive. From the nearby fields, the low moan of the wind swept across the land, carrying with it the subtle promise of a biting winter yet to come. Rafn rose slowly, his joints stiff from the cold and the hard bench he'd slept upon. His fingers brushed the rough wood beside him, worn smooth by years of use. The cabin smelled of damp earth and smoke, mingling with the faint scent of sweat and unwashed bodies, a scent he had long ceased to notice. He dressed quietly in his simple, coarse linen tunic and patched woolen trousers, pulling on boots hardened by mud and salt. The iron ring clinked softly as he moved, a weight that weighed heavier on his spirit than on his flesh. Outside the cabin, the village was beginning to stir, but the usual vigor seemed absent. Something hung in the air, a tension as palpable as the cold. Rafn stepped outside, the cold cutting through his thin clothes like a blade. The sky above was awash of pale gray, the sun yet to rise fully. His gaze traveled to the fjord, where dark waters lapped endlessly at the rocky shore, their relentless rhythm a reminder of forces far greater than any man. The scent of brine and wood smoke filled his nostrils as he drew a slow breath, trying to steel himself for the day ahead. The village of Ravnholm was small but sturdy. Its timbered houses were clustered tightly along the shore, their walls blackened from years of smoke and salt. Smoke from morning fires curled upwards, weaving through the skeletal branches of leafless trees. The sound of a distant bird call echoed, sharp and lonely in the quiet dawn. Rafn's footsteps crunched over frost-hardened earth as he made his way toward the man's quarters, the cabin where his father, Kettle, lived. The old thrall was a shadow of the man he once had been, worn down by years of servitude and a body broken by time and toil. Kettle's hair was silvered and sparse, his beard jagged and unkempt. His face bore the deep lines of age and hardship, his pale blue eyes faded, but still holding a quiet strength. Inside the dim cabin, the faint glow of embers struggled against the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and peat smoke. Kettle sat hunched over a small wooden bench, his brittle hands trembling as he struggled to strike sparks from a flint to kindle the fire. His breath came in shallow, rasping coughs that seemed to sap the very warmth from the room. Rafn approached silently, the heavy weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Let me try, Father," he said softly, taking the flint from the old man's grasp. Kettle's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded without protest. "The gods do not favor me this dawn," he murmured, voice rough with age. "I dreamed of corvids circling above our roof. A dark omen." Rafn's heart clenched at the words. He had learned long ago to fear omens, especially those whispered by his father. The corvids, ravens or crows, were messengers of the gods, often heralds of death or misfortune. Yet he forced himself to hold back the tide of dread swelling inside, unwilling to burden his father further. He struck the flint, sparks catching on the dried moss and kindling until a small flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. The fire's warmth was meager but welcome. Kettle drew in a shuddering breath, his pale hands fumbling to grasp a thin wooden mug filled with water. Rafn watched the rise and fall of his father's chest, the shallow breaths betraying his frailty. The old man's battle with age was a slow one, etched into every tremor and every labored cough. Outside, the village continued to awaken. The clang of metal grew louder as the blacksmith's hammer rose and fell, shaping steel that would become weapons or tools. The scent of freshly baked bread from the communal ovens drifted through the air, mingling with the salt and smoke. Children's voices, still muffled and cautious, echoed faintly between the timbered buildings. Rafn's daily rhythm was one of servitude and survival. From dawn until dusk, he labored unceasingly, tending to menial tasks, carrying firewood to the forge, cleaning the great hall of the Jarl, and fetching water from the well. His hands were rough and calloused, the skin cracked from the cold and hard labor. Despite the exhaustion, his mind was never idle. He watched, he listened, he learned the unspoken rules of power and submission that governed his world. At 19, he bore the weight of his status with a quiet dignity, but beneath the surface, a fire burned. The life of a thrall was one of invisibility and disregard, yet Rafn's gaze held a restless hunger, for freedom, for justice, for a chance to prove his worth beyond the iron ring and scars. He made his way toward the great hall, where the village's power was concentrated. The building loomed large, constructed of thick timber logs, its walls adorned with carved animal heads and shields that spoke of battles long past. Smoke rose from the central hearth, and the scent of roasting meat mingled with the earthy aroma of the wooden beams. Inside, the hall was alive with murmurs and tension. Men gathered around long tables, their faces stern beneath hoods and helmets. The Jarl Thorvald sat upon a raised platform, his imposing figure a stark contrast to the humble thrall who approached with a wooden tray bearing a cup of honeyed mead. Thorvald was a man carved from the very stone of the mountains, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of ripe wheat streaked by gray. His blue eyes, sharp and unyielding, bore the coldness of winter seas, and a jagged scar sliced across his right eye, a permanent reminder of past conflicts. The silver brooch that adorned his cloak gleamed in the firelight, a symbol of lineage and authority. As Rafn moved quietly among the gathered men, serving their drinks, he caught snippets of conversation, whispers of a theft that had unsettled the village. A treasured silver brooch, an heirloom passed down through generations of Jarls, had vanished overnight. The weight of suspicion hung like a storm cloud over the hall. The Jarl's voice rang out, resolute and unforgiving. "Whoever dares steal from me shall pay with his life," Thorvald declared, his fist pounding the heavy wooden table. The hall fell into a tense silence, all eyes turning toward the man who dared to wield such absolute power. Rafn felt the cold gaze of the Jarl on him, a moment longer than was necessary. The larger of the two men, Gunnar Maudefaro, shoved Rafn back with a rough hand. His gloved fist, reinforced with iron plates, was a visible badge of his strength and status. His dark eyes gleamed with a calculating cruelty. "Your father steals from the Jarl," he spat. The brooch was found among his things. Rafn's voice cracked with desperation. He would never, not after all these years. "Silence, Thrall," Gunnar growled. "The Jarl's will is law." Dragged, his father's frail body nearly breaking with each step, Rafn followed them to the great hall. The gathering crowd fell silent as they entered, all eyes locked on the condemned man. Thorvald's icy gaze bored down upon Kettle, his voice echoing through the hall. "For 30 years, you have served me, and now you repay me with theft." The silver brooch gleamed against his tunic, a stark reminder of the trust broken. Kettle's lips trembled as he swore his innocence by the gods. Yet the Jarl's expression hardened. Thralls do not swear by the gods. They obey their masters. Then, turning his piercing gaze to Rafn, the Jarl pronounced their fate. "You, the son, will witness your father's punishment. Both will face execution at dawn. Let this be a lesson to all who would betray me." The hall erupted in murmurs, some cold, others filled with shock and sorrow. Rafn's knees felt weak, the floor tilting beneath him. Yet beneath the despair, a flicker of defiance sparked within. His father was innocent, and he would not let the flames of injustice consume them both. That night, beneath the indifferent stars and the harsh breath of winter wind, chains bit cruelly into skin and bones. Rafn lay beside his father on the cold earth, sharing the shivering silence of condemned men. Outside, the distant howl of wolves mingled with the rustling wings of ravens circling above, omens of death and darkness. But within Rafn, beneath the bruises and scars, a seed of resistance took root. The thrall was no longer a shadow to be crushed. He was a son, a bearer of truth, and soon, he would take a stand that would echo beyond the fjord and the snow. The dawn would bring judgment, but until then, hope burned quietly, stubborn as the fire flickering in the hearth. The village of Ravenholm lay in uneasy stillness as the hours crept forward. Rafn's world had contracted to the small, cold space between himself and his father, bound by iron chains and the heavy weight of accusation. The past, once a blur of labor and survival, now sharpened into painful clarity. He recalled the countless mornings spent alongside Kettle, the old man's stoic guidance etched into his memory. The lessons of humility and endurance, the stories of gods and heroes whispered in the flickering firelight, these were the threads of a life woven under the shadow of servitude. Yet, among them, had always been an unspoken truth, that even thralls carried the blood of free men and the fire of their ancestors. Rafn's thoughts drifted to the first time he had seen Thyra, the freeman's daughter with fiery hair and fierce green eyes, her presence a spark of light in the darkness of his existence. Their stolen glances and quiet moments of shared understanding had been small rebellions against the harshness of their world. Now, as the night deepened, he wondered if that spark could ignite a flame strong enough to change their fate. Outside, the cold wind whispered through the trees, a mournful song that spoke of endings and new beginnings. The weight of chains was heavy, but heavier still was the burden of truth left unspoken, and the courage it would take to speak it aloud. The night stretched on, thick with fear and fragile hope. And in the heart of a thrall, beneath the scarred skin and iron ring, a quiet resolve began to take shape. The cold night pressed down on Ravenholm like a shroud. The village was silent, save for the distant howl of wolves carried on the bitter wind. Shadows pooled beneath the skeletal trees, clutching at the edges of flickering torchlight. Rafn lay on the frozen earth, his back sore from the cruel lashings of the day, chains biting into his wrists and ankles. Beside him, His father's shallow breathing was a fragile thread weaving through the stillness. The weight of despair was suffocating. The world felt impossibly small, reduced to the bitter cold, the iron ring around his neck, the certainty of dawn's execution. But beneath the bruises, beneath the exhaustion, a storm churned within Rafn's chest. He could not surrender to the Jarl's verdict, not while the truth remained buried in shadows. As he stared at the starless sky, a faint rustle caught his attention, a soft, uneven breathing weaving through the night. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw a figure huddled near the edge of the village, pressed against the rough bark of a withered oak. A girl, no older than 12 winters, her body trembling as if trying to shrink away from the biting cold. Her hair was tangled, the bright red strands dulled by dirt and dampness. Her face, pale and streaked with tears, bore the rawness of fear and abandonment. She wore a ragged cloak, patched and threadbare, barely shielding her from the night. In her hands, she clutched something close, a small bundle wrapped tightly in faded cloth. Instinct stirred within Rafn. He knew this girl, or at least her story. Thyra had once whispered of the feral children who drifted between clans, lost to the harshness of winter and the cruelty of men. Children born into hardship, forsaken or orphaned, left to fend for themselves on the edges of the world. This girl was one of them, a ghost among the living. For a long moment, Rafn hesitated. The chains around his wrists were a brutal reminder of his own captivity. His body ached from wounds, his spirit frayed by the weight of impending death. To reach out, to offer aid, was a risk. The Jarl's law was unforgiving. Harboring the weak, sheltering those deemed unworthy, could bring swift and brutal punishment. But the girl's eyes met his, wide and pleading, shimmering with a silent desperation he could not ignore. She was no threat. She was a broken soul, as trapped in her own prison as he was in his. He shifted, the chains clinking softly. "What are you doing here?" he whispered, voice rough and low. His breath plumed in the frigid air. The girl flinched, but answered, voice barely audible. I have nowhere else to go. They cast me out. Said I was cursed." Her words trembled with disbelief and sorrow. "I heard the wolves. I thought, maybe the gods would take me." Rafn's heart clenched. The cruel world had placed them both on the edge of despair, yet here was a flicker of innocence facing the darkness alone. In that moment, the line between thrall and free, accused and accuser, seemed to blur into nothingness. He moved slowly, careful not to startle her. "You're not cursed," he said softly. "The gods do not simply cast away children." Her lip quivered, tears spilling silently down her dirt-streaked cheeks. "But no one wants me, not even my own kin." Rafn's mind raced. To take her in would be to invite danger. The Jarl's wrath was quick to follow whispers of rebellion or defiance. Yet to turn away was to condemn her to the cold jaws of the forest, to death or worse. The chains rattled as he struggled to sit upright, his body screaming in protest. He reached into the folds of his tunic and pulled out the small silver pendant Thyra had given him days before, a simple charm, a gift of hope. He pressed it into the girl's trembling hands. "For Freya," he said quietly. "May she watch over you." She clutched the charm as if it were a talisman against the darkness itself. "Why? Why would you help me?" Rafn looked away, eyes fixed on the horizon where the first hint of dawn stirred. "Because, sometimes, even the smallest flame can light the darkest night." The girl's gaze lingered on his face, searching. "But what about you? Your chains, your fate." He swallowed the lump in his throat. "I do not yet know what the gods will decide. But if I have the strength, I will not let fear be my master." Their moment was shattered by a harsh bark, the snap of footsteps approaching through the snow-crisped air. Rafn's head snapped toward the sound, heart pounding. Figures emerged from the shadows, two of the Jarl's warriors, faces grim beneath the heavy furs and helmets. "Move away from him," one commanded, eyes narrowing at the girl. This thrall is under guard. Rafn stepped protectively in front of the girl. The girl looked up at him, a fragile smile breaking through the tears. Thank you, Rafn. His name on her lips was a balm against the cold, a fragile thread binding one lost soul to another. In the cruel world of Ravenholm, where chains ruled bodies and fear ruled hearts, this small act of defiance was a spark. But the dawn would bring more than light. It would bring judgment, a reckoning that could shatter everything. Rafn knew the path ahead was perilous. To help this girl was to risk everything: freedom, life, even the fragile hope he carried for his father's justice. Yet in that moment, as the stars faded and cold winds whispered through the trees, the choice was clear. No matter the cost, he would stand for those who could not stand for themselves. The night deepened again, wrapping the village in its bitter embrace. Somewhere beyond the dark, the distant cry of a wolf echoed, a call to the wild, to fate, and to the courage buried deep within a young thrall who, for the first time, refused to bow. As silence settled once more, Rafn felt a strange kinship with the girl at his side. Both were pawns caught in the harsh game of power and survival. Both had chains, some seen and some invisible. But where one had given in to despair, he had made his choice. The flame of rebellion flickered quietly inside him, fragile but unextinguished. And as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed into the horizon, Rafn rose slowly, the cold biting into his wounds, the chains clinking like the toll of an unseen bell. He would face the Jarl. He would demand truth. And he would protect those who could not protect themselves. Because even a thrall could choose honor over fear. Even a thrall could fight. Even a thrall could be free. The cold pressed relentlessly against the thin walls of the thrall's cabin as Rafn guided the trembling girl inside. The rough wooden planks groaned underfoot, and the smell of dried moss and old smoke clung to the air, thick and unyielding. He moved with careful urgency, but also with a gentleness that surprised even himself. Each step was a small rebellion against the harshness that defined his days, a silent promise to protect this fragile life now entrusted to him. The flickering light of a dying hearth cast weak shadows across the cramped space. Rafn crouched near the small fire, cupping his hands over the feeble warmth as the girl stood uncertainly in the corner, her red hair a wild flame against the gloom. She hugged her knees, her breath shallow and quick, eyes wide and haunted by the cold and the weight of a world that had turned its back on her. He watched her carefully, noting the faint tremble that ran through her limbs, the way her shoulders jerked as if carrying invisible burdens far heavier than the ragged cloak wrapped around her. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and frozen tears, but beneath the fragility, there was a flicker of fierce life, a stubborn spark that refused to be extinguished. Without a word, Rafn reached behind a loose plank near the door and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in coarse cloth. Inside lay a crust of dark bread and a few dried berries, remnants of yesterday's meager rations. He held the food out to her in an open palm, his eyes softening. The girl hesitated, suspicion and hunger warring in her gaze. Slowly, she reached forward, fingers trembling, and accepted the offering. The bread cracked under her bite, crumbs catching on cracked lips as she ate in silence. Rafn sat nearby, watching the slow return of color to her cheeks as hunger eased, the tension in her frame loosening just a fraction. A long pause settled between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of wolves beyond the village. Speech was unnecessary. In the shared quiet, a fragile trust began to weave its delicate threads, unspoken yet real. Finally, the girl spoke, her voice a fragile whisper barely audible above the hearth's faint crackling. "Thank you," she said in the tongue of the village, but with a sharp accent, a hint of a distant land, or perhaps a clan long estranged. Her words carried the rough edges of hardship, but also the tenderness of gratitude. Rafn nodded, the knot of worry in his chest tightening. "What is your name?" he asked gently. She looked down, fingers twisting the edge of her cloak. "Erica," she replied, the name foreign yet fitting for the wildness in her eyes. "They call me cursed." He frowned, the bitterness of that word stinging the air between them. Cursed. The notion seemed too cruel, too final for someone so young, so alive despite it all. She nodded, biting her lip. "My kin. They said the gods turned their backs on me. I was born under a bad sign. The wolves howl when I sleep, and the winds whisper my name with bitterness." Rafn's gaze softened, memories stirring of the stories his father had told, of fate and prophecy, of gods who both blessed and condemned with equal indiscretion. "The gods do not curse so easily," he said firmly. "They test us, yes, but they do not abandon those who fight for their lives." Erica's eyes caught his, searching and uncertain. "Do you believe that? You a Thrall?" The question hung between them, heavier than chains and colder than winter nights. Rafn swallowed, feeling the weight of his own burden, the iron ring, the lash marks, the chains that bound his body but never quite his spirit. "I believe in truth," he replied quietly, "and in those who choose to carry it, no matter the cost." She nodded slowly, the fragile barrier cracking. "I have nowhere else to go. The woods are dangerous, and the night colder still. But here," she glanced around the humble cabin, "it is warm." "Thank you." Rafn offered a faint smile, the first genuine one in days. "You are safe here for now." He turned to the small bench where a tattered blanket lay folded. Gently, he helped her settle down, wrapping the coarse fabric around her thin shoulders. The warmth of the fire brushed against her pale skin, chasing away some of the chill that had clung so stubbornly. Observing her closely, Rafn's eyes caught the faint scar along the girl's left wrist, delicate yet deep enough to speak of pain endured. The mark told a story she had not yet shared, a silent testament to hardship and survival. There was also the faint scent of iron and ash clinging to her clothes, perhaps from some forge or smithy far away. "Were you hurt?" he asked softly, nodding toward the scar. Erica's jaw tightened, and she shook her head slowly. "Not by men, by fate." Her voice was steady but carried a trace of sorrow. "The burn is old, but it reminds me to be careful." Rafn reached into the folds of his own tunic and pulled out a small cloth pouch containing dried herbs and a bit of resin, a meager offering of the knowledge passed down by his mother, who had tended wounds long ago. He sat beside her, the faint glow of the fire drawing shadows across their faces. "Let me help," he said quietly, dipping his fingers into the pouch and gently cleaning the scarred skin. The girl flinched but did not pull away, the trust growing like fragile ice beginning to melt. As he worked, neither spoke, the silence between them a sacred space, fragile and filled with meaning. His fingers were rough and calloused, yet careful, tracing the edges of pain and healing. The scent of herbs mingled with the smoke, blending into a balm that soothed more than just the flesh. When he finished, Rafn looked up. Erica's eyes were bright, reflecting the flicker of flames and something softer. Hope, perhaps, or the rare comfort of being seen and cared for. "Thank you," she whispered again, voice thick with emotion. He nodded, feeling a warmth that had little to do with the fire. "You are not alone anymore." Outside, the night deepened, the howl of wolves fading into the distance as the village lay quiet, save for the soft crackle of the dying hearth. Inside the cramped cabin, two souls, one bound by iron chains, the other by scars of fate, found fleeting sanctuary in the fragile bond forged by kindness and defiance. Rafn's gaze lingered on the girl, the weight of his own fears momentarily lifted. For the first time in many moons, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the cold grasp of chains and judgment. A future where even the lowliest thrall might protect those in need, and where honor was not the sole domain of the free. The night stretched onward, holding its breath as the slowly thawing bond between Rafn and Erica bloomed quietly in the shadow of a coming dawn. In that small space, amidst the scent, the Jarl Thorvald's fury was the heart of the storm. His voice had thundered across the great hall, commanding that the search for the Thrall be swift and relentless. Find him, the Jarl had ordered, his breath cold and hard as the winter winds. Let none hide him or aid him, or they, too, shall answer to me. Gunnar Maudifero's execution had been swift and merciless. The body hung from the village gates, a grim sentinel warning all who might consider defiance. But even his death had not quelled the unrest. Rather, it seemed to fan the flames of turmoil. Among the villagers, feelings were divided. Some saw Rafn's act as reckless, a dangerous challenge to order and tradition. Others, quiet, few, but growing, hardened their resolve in secret, admiring the Thrall's courage and the truth he had unveiled. Yet, all were forced to reckon with the consequences of his defiance. Rafn's dilemma lay heavy and twisted within him. Every step he took in the village was watched, every glance a potential threat. Yet his resolve was unwavering. He had freed his father, though the old man's body was frail and burdened by years of hardship. He had shielded Erica, the wild girl with haunted eyes, from a cruel fate. And yet, with every act of mercy, he drew closer to the edge of a precipice. The Jarl's men scoured the village and surrounding woods, their search growing desperate. They questioned neighbors, pressed the smiths and traders for information, and interrogated anyone who might have offered aid or shelter to the fugitive Thrall. Rumors of hidden caches and secret meetings spread like a poison, turning friends into suspects. One harsh morning, as a biting wind cut through the tents of the traders, a group of cloaked figures arrived from a neighboring clan. They had heard the news. Word travels fast in these lands, carried by traders, travelers, and soldiers alike. Their leader, a tall man with a weather-beaten face and eyes like chipped flint, approached the Jarl with a grave warning. The unrest in Ravenholm is no longer hidden, he said, voice low and urgent. Other clans watch closely. If your law is weakened by this treason, it may invite raids or worse. Strength must be shown, swiftly and without mercy. Thorvald's jaw tightened. He was a man who ruled not just by tradition, but by the grip of fear and power. To show weakness was unthinkable. Yet beneath that cold exterior, a flicker of doubt gnawed at him. A question he dared not voice aloud. What if the truth had been twisted? What if the brother of falsehood was at his own table? Meanwhile, Rafn remained a shadow moving through the village's edges, a ghost among the living. He sought no refuge in the halls of men, but found fleeting sanctuary in the forest's embrace. The ancient trees, gnarled and stoic, seemed to offer a quiet strength. Here, the wind whispered secrets older than the clans, and the cold earth beneath his feet was a reminder of the harshness and beauty of the world beyond chains. Yet, the forest held its own dangers. Wolves stalked in the night, their eyes gleaming like embers in the dark. Bandits and rival clans could strike without warning, and the unforgiving landscape offered little mercy to the weak or unwary. Each moment spent outside the village walls was a gamble between life and death. One evening, as twilight bled into night, Rafn returned to the small cabin where his father rested and where Erica waited, her eyes wide and haunted. The small fire flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts upon the walls. The warmth was meager, but the quiet companionship was a balm against the cold and the growing storm. Do they search for you? Erica's voice was a fragile thread in the room's heavy silence. They do, Rafn replied, lifting a small piece of bread to his lips. And for the old man, too. But no one will find us here. Not yet. Erica looked away, biting her lip nervously. I fear what will come if they do. Rafn's jaw tightened. We cannot hide forever. The longer this lingers, the more it will grow. Soon, The Jarl's wrath will extend beyond these walls. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the wooden planks and carrying the scent of smoke and fear. The village was no longer just a place of labor and submission. It was a crucible of tension and danger. In the days that followed, rumors swirled that the Jarl had sent envoys to neighboring clans, seeking mercenaries and allies to reinforce his rule. The air was thick with the threat of violence, the promise of bloodshed if order was not swiftly restored. Rafn wrestled with the knowledge that his actions had shaken the foundation of Ravenholm's fragile peace. Could he bear the cost of truth? Could he protect those who had placed their fragile trust in him? His father, Erica, and even the reluctant sympathizers among the villagers? The weight of responsibility settled like a stone in his chest. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the fjord's jagged peaks, a visitor arrived at the cabin. He was an elder from a neighboring village, a man whose reputation for wisdom and neutrality stretched beyond the fjord. His face was weathered, his eyes kind but sharp. "I have heard of your plight, Thrall," the elder said quietly. "The threads of this tale have reached my village. I come not as a judge, but as one who seeks balance." Rafn's posture stiffened. "Why do you come?" "Because the web of suspicion binds more than your village," the elder replied. "If darkness festers here, it will spread. Your courage has sparked a flame, but fire can consume as well as warm." The elder's words settled heavily in the room. They spoke not only of danger, but of the fine line between justice and chaos. Rafn felt the truth in them. His fight was no longer just his own. It had become a battle for the soul of a community teetering on the edge. That night, as the village slept under a canopy of cold stars, Rafn stood watch by the cabin's door. The wind carried distant voices, guards patrolling, dogs barking, the faint murmur of plodding men. His eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. The chains had been removed from his neck, but the invisible shackles of fear and expectation remained. To protect those he loved, he knew he would have to face not only the Jarl's men but the judgment of the village itself. A sudden rustle in the underbrush made him tense. He gripped the small dagger hidden beneath his tunic, the steel cool and reassuring in his hand. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Thyra, her red hair a vivid flame against the night. "They grow restless," she whispered, her green eyes shining with worry. "Gunnar's death has unsettled more than the Jarl's anger. Some want blood, not just yours, but anyone who dares to stand with you." Rafn nodded grimly. "Then we must be ready, not just to fight with blades, but with truth and courage." Thyra reached out, her hand brushing against his. "You are no longer alone." Together, they stood in the cold dark, two souls bound by shared defiance. The dawn would come soon, and with it, the reckoning. But for now, in the quiet between the storms, there was a fragile hope, a promise that even in the face of overwhelming force, the spirit of resistance could endure. The world beyond Ravenholm was watching. Enemies lurked in the shadows, alliances shifted like the tides, and the weight of generations bore down on a young thrall's shoulders. Yet, despite it all, Rafn's resolve burned bright, a flame that no chain could smother. And as the first pale light touched the horizon, the village held its breath. The reckoning was near. The dawn's cold light crept hesitantly over the jagged peaks framing Ravenholm, casting long shadows across the frost-hardened earth. The village, usually alive with the early bustle of labor, stood unervingly still. Smoke hung thin and gray from the chimneys, but the hearth fires burned low, as if the people themselves feared what the new day might bring. Whispers, once hushed and secretive, had become a tense murmur through the wooden walls and narrow streets. Everyone knew what awaited. Rafn stood at the edge of the small clearing behind the thrall's cabin, his breath billowing in pale clouds before him. The sharp bite of the morning chilled through the thin fabric of his worn tunic. but the cold was nothing compared to the storm gathering within his chest. He was no longer the boy who had silently borne lashings and mockery. Now, he carried more than chains, the weight of a father's innocence, the fragile trust of those few who dared stand. As the group approached the thrall's cabin, the crowd that had once watched silently now spilled into the clearing, eyes sharp with accusation and fear. Some faces were twisted with anger, others betrayed doubt, a flicker of uncertainty in a sea of judgment. The tension was so thick it seemed to press against Rafn's skin, suffocating and relentless. Thorvald's voice rang out, cold and commanding. "Rafn Ketilson, you stand accused of defying your lord and harboring traitors. You have broken the laws of Ravenholm and endangered the peace." Rafn stepped forward, the chains of his past heavy but no longer defining him. "I stand here not as a traitor, Jarl, but as a son seeking justice. My father is innocent. The true thief hides behind lies and fear." The Jarl's lips curled into a bitter smile. Bold words from a thrall whose insolence earned him lashes and chains. "You challenge my authority with nothing but words and desperation." "Words carry the weight of truth, my lord," Rafn replied steadily, eyes unwavering. "Truth that you have refused to see." The crowd murmured, some shifting in discomfort as the impossible unfolded, a thrall confronting the Jarl with a voice strong enough to silence the gathering. Thyra stepped forward beside him, her voice clear and unwavering. "I bear witness. It was Gunnar Maudefaro who planted the brooch. I saw him enter Ketil's cabin the night of the theft. The Jarl's justice has been fooled by a man who hides behind steel and cruelty." An uneasy silence followed her words, broken only by the harsh breath of the wind through the bare branches. Thorvald's eyes narrowed, his gaze flitting between Thyra and the thrall before him. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Enough," he bellowed suddenly, his voice sharp as the edge of a sword. "You would see me a fool? That my trusted warrior would betray me? I have heard enough to know you conspire to undermine the will of Ravenholm." Rafn's heart hammered. The Jarl's wrath was a tempest, and yet the thrall stood firm. "Judge me fairly, my lord. Let the truth be weighed, not buried beneath fear." Thorvald's hand dropped to the hilt of his sword. "Very well. Gunnar's guilt shall be judged once more, but be warned, thrall. You walk a fine line between courage and folly." From the shadows, one of Thorvald's warriors stepped forward, dragging a bloodied and disarmed Gunnar. His face was a grim mask, the cut across his cheek fresh and angry. His eyes flickered with a mixture of defiance and desperation. "I confess," Gunnar spat bitterly, "the brooch was mine to sell. I planted it to cover debts and debts alone." Murmurs erupted from the crowd, some voices rising in anger, others in surprised relief. Gunnar's confession shattered the fragile veil of lies that had cloaked the accusation. Thorvald's gaze hardened. "You have dishonored your name and betrayed this village. Your fate is sealed." Turning toward Rafn, the Jarl's voice lowered, almost grudging. "Your father walks free of blame. As for you—" He paused, the weight of authority heavy in his words. "You shall bear the punishment for your defiance. 30 lashes to remind any thrall of their place." Rafn met the Jarl's gaze without flinching. "I accept your judgment." The crowd watched as Thorvald ordered the preparations. The wooden post for the lashes was brought forth, the makeshift arena for punishment and spectacle. The air was thick with tension, the bitter wind a cold witness to the unfolding drama. As the first lash cracked against Rafn's back, pain flared hot and raw, but he remained silent, standing tall against the humiliation. With each strike, memories of his father's steady gaze and Thyra's unwavering support filled his mind. The pain was a physical tether to his choice, a reminder that freedom was often won through sacrifice. When the punishment ended, Rafn remained upright, the fire in his eyes undimmed. The Jarl's stern gaze softened just enough to betray a grudging respect. "Go," Thorvald commanded. "Live as you will, thrall. but remember the chains you bear. Rafn turned, the heavy iron ring still clasped around his neck, but inside, the shackles had begun to crumble. Beside him, Thyra and Kettle approached, their faces etched with relief and new hope. Kettle's old eyes met his son's, shimmering with pride beneath the weariness of years. You chose the path of truth, Rafn. That is freedom no chain can bind. As the crowd dispersed, the first rays of sun touched the village. The corvids Rafn's father had feared circled overhead, not as harbingers of death, but watchers of a new dawn. Rafn looked toward the horizon, the chill of the morning wind brushing his raw skin. The road ahead was uncertain, the weight of the past heavy, but his spirit was unbroken. He had fought not just for his father, but for the fragile honor of all who had been silenced. In the quiet after the storm, the thrall stood tall, a man shaped by hardship but defined by courage. And in Ravenholm, the chains of fear had begun to fall away. The days that followed the public reckoning were a fragile dance between hope and the ever-present shadow of reprisal. Though Kettle was freed from the stain of false accusation, and Rafn bore the scars of his punishment, the village did not immediately return to its former rhythms. The weight of what had transpired lingered in every glance, in every whispered conversation behind closed doors. Rafn found himself both an outcast and a beacon, a man no longer invisible, but not yet accepted. The chains of his thraldom remained physical and symbolic, but inside him, something far greater had been unleashed, a will that could not be broken. In the mornings, he walked beside his father along the rough paths of Ravenholm, each step a testament to survival and resilience. Kettle's frail frame was steadied by the steady determination in his son's eyes. They spoke little, for words were often brittle in the cold air, but the bond between them deepened with each shared silence. Thyra remained a steadfast ally, her presence a fiery contrast to the gray skies and frozen earth. Together, they tended to the wounded pride of the village's thralls, offering quiet support where they could, knitting together small pockets of resistance against the oppressive weight of tradition. But the Jarl Thorvald was not a man to be easily softened. His rule was tempered by the hard lessons of power and the need to maintain order in a world carved by steel and blood. Yet, even he could not ignore the flicker of change sparked by Rafn's defiance. In the great hall, behind the heavy doors adorned with carvings of ancient beasts, Thorvald contemplated the shifting tides. The brooch that had sparked the chaos rested once more at his side, its silver gleaming like the cold edge of a promise. He understood that ruling was not simply about force, but about the fragile balance between fear and respect. And in that balance, the thrall who had dared to speak, who had dared to be heard, had altered the course of Ravenholm's destiny. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, Rafn stood at the edge of the fjord. The waters stretched endlessly before him, their surface glittering like shattered glass beneath the moon's pale light. The iron ring around his neck felt heavier somehow, yet his shoulders carried its weight with a newfound strength. Beside him, Kettle's voice broke the silence, a whisper carried on the cold wind. You have changed more than your fate, son. You have changed the story we tell ourselves. Rafn nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where water met sky. Chains bind the body, father, but never the spirit. Even a thrall can be free. The corvids circled above, their black wings tracing ancient patterns against the night. They were no longer omens of doom, but messengers of a truth as old as the gods themselves, that honor, courage, and hope could rise from even the darkest places. And so, beneath the watchful stars and the silent witness of the fjord, a young thrall's journey, marked by pain, defiance, and love, found its quiet resolution. Not with the clang of swords or the roar of battle, but with the steadfast beating of a heart that refused to be broken. Rafn Kettleson had fought for his father, for truth, for freedom. And in doing so, he proved that no chain, no matter how heavy, could hold down a soul determined to rise. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the frosted window panes, casting a soft glow over the small cabin where Rafn lay. Outside, the village was awakening slowly. The usual sounds of morning, children's laughter, the hammering of metal, the low murmur of voices, were tempered by the memory of recent upheaval. Yet, beneath the surface, a subtle transformation was taking root. The tremors of change, though faint, carried a promise. Rafn rose carefully, the pain sharp but bearable. His hands worked instinctively, gathering the few simple items that marked their humble existence. A worn cloak, a wooden cup, a small leather pouch with precious dried herbs. The weight of the iron ring around his neck was constant, yet it no longer defined him. It was a symbol, yes, but no longer a shackle. As he stepped outside, the chill air wrapped around him, crisp and unforgiving. The village lay quiet still, the long shadows of morning stretching across the frost-covered ground. Figures moved cautiously, eyes heavy with the memory of violence and justice meted in harsh measure. Thyra approached silently, her vibrant red hair catching the weak sunlight like a flame. Her green eyes held a softness now, tempered by relief and cautious optimism. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, bread and salted fish, simple tokens of care. "Rafn," she said quietly, voice steady but warm, "the village is uneasy. But they speak of you now with respect, not just suspicion. Your courage has stirred something old, something that cannot be undone." He met her gaze, the fire within his own eyes steady and bright. "It is not courage alone," he replied. "It is truth. And even in chains, truth cannot be silenced forever." Together, they moved toward the great hall, the heart of Ravnholm's power and the stage of so many fateful moments. The heavy wooden doors stood closed, symbols of authority and tradition. Yet, today they seemed less imposing, as if the village itself was ready to bend, if only slightly, towards something new. Inside, the Jarl Thorvald awaited, seated upon his carved throne. His presence was as formidable as ever, his wolfskin cloak draped across broad shoulders, the silver brooch gleaming like a cold promise. But in his eyes, behind the usual steel, something flickered, the grudging respect born of witnessing defiance and truth. When Rafn entered with Thyra by his side, the hall fell into a hush. The assembled men and women watched intently, the weight of their judgment palpable. Yet, it was not the same oppressive atmosphere that had filled the space days before. There was an undercurrent of change, a hint that the old order might yet be challenged. Thorvald's voice cut through the silence, sharp but measured. "Rafn Ketilson," he began, "you have confronted the very laws of Ravnholm and shaken its foundations. Yet you stand before me, alive and unbroken. For that, you must be heard." Rafn's heart pounded, but his voice did not falter. "My lord, I sought only to defend what was true. My father is no thief. The real betrayal came from a man trusted beyond reason, Gunnar Maudefaro." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some faces reddening with shame, others nodding in reluctant agreement. Thyra stepped forward, her tone clear and unwavering. "I witnessed Gunnar's deceit. His greed and lies endangered us all." Thorvald's gaze settled on the thrall and then on Thyra. "Your words have saved a man's life and revealed a traitor," he acknowledged. "Such truth is not easy to bear nor simple to accept." Rafn lowered his eyes briefly before meeting the Jarl's steady stare again. "I ask not for mercy, but for justice, for the chains that bind me to be more than iron, and for the honor of those who serve beneath your rule to be recognized." A silence stretched, the weight of the moment pressing upon all present. Then, with a slow nod, Thorvald spoke, his voice quieter but no less commanding. "You will bear the scars of your defiance, Thrall, as punishment and lesson. But your father is free, and your name cleared. Let this be the beginning of a new understanding." The hall exhaled collectively, tension easing but not entirely dissipated. Raffen felt the eyes of the villagers, some filled with respect, others with lingering doubt, but none could deny the transformation that had taken place. Later, outside beneath the pale light, Kettle waited, leaning heavily on a wooden staff. When Raffen approached, the old man's eyes shone with pride and relief, the burden of accusation lifted. "My son," Kettle said, voice trembling with emotion, "you fought not just for me, but for all who have been bound by chains, seen and unseen. You have given us a glimmer of hope in the dark." Raffen took his father's hand, the rough skin a testament to years of suffering and endurance. "We walk together now," he replied, "not as thrall and master, but as kin and witnesses to a truth that cannot be buried." Thyra joined them, her presence steady and warm. "The village will heal," she said softly. "Slowly, but it will. Your courage has planted a seed." As the three stood beneath the awakening sky, the distant calls of corvids echoed, a sound no longer feared, but embraced as a sign of watchfulness and change. The bitter winds that had once carried only despair now whispered a different tale. Raffen looked to the horizon, where the fjord stretched endlessly, shimmering between ice and sky. The iron ring at his neck was still there, but the chains that had bound his spirit were broken. Inside, a fire burned, a steady flame of resilience and hope that no man, no matter how powerful, could extinguish. The road ahead remained uncertain, marked by hardship and the cautious steps of a village learning to reckon with its own shadows. But Raffen walked it with a new strength, one born not of chains or fear, but of truth, honor, and the unyielding will to be free. In the quiet dawn, beneath the watchful gaze of the gods and the silent flight of ravens, a young thrall's journey of redemption found its fragile and hard-won peace. The days that followed were quiet, but charged with the subtle currents of change. Ravenholm moved cautiously, as if holding its breath, uncertain whether the fragile peace would endure or shatter beneath the weight of old resentments and new hopes. The bitter wind still cut through the village, but there was a gentler warmth beneath the surface, a thawing not just of ice, but of hearts long hardened by suspicion. Raffen felt the shift keenly. Though still bound by the iron ring around his neck, the invisible chains that once restrained his spirit had loosened. His scars were a testament not only to pain, but to survival and defiance. He walked the village paths with a new bearing, no longer invisible, no longer just a thrall, but a man who had dared to speak truth to power and had lived to see it change. Kettle, though frail and worn, carried a lightness in his step. The weight of false accusations lifted from his shoulders like a heavy shroud, leaving room for a quiet dignity to re-emerge. His eyes, once clouded by fear, now gleamed with the fragile hope of a man who had witnessed his son stand against fate and win a measure of justice. The villagers watched this slow transformation with a mix of wariness and wonder. Some whispered in hushed tones, questioning whether the old ways could bend without breaking. Others, particularly the younger men and women, found courage in Raffen's example, a spark that hinted at a future where honor and truth might carry more weight than bloodlines and iron chains. Thyra remained a steadfast presence, a bright flame in the gray landscape of Ravenholm. Her hands, still calloused from the forge, now offered comfort as much as labor. She moved among the villagers with quiet confidence, a bridge between worlds, her fierce green eyes reflecting a determination to carve out a better life for those who had been cast to the edges. Erica, the wild girl who had once trembled in the cold night, now walked with steadier steps. The warmth of the cabin and the kindness of Raffen had begun to heal the wounds that fate had dealt her. Though scars traced her skin and shadows lingered behind her bright eyes, She was no longer a ghost among the living. In the cautious acceptance of Ravenholm's people, she found a fragile refuge, a place to belong. The Jarl Thorvald, for all his sternness and strength, was not untouched by the events that had shaken his hall. Behind the wolfskin cloak and cold stare, a quiet reckoning. One crisp morning, as the sun spilled pale gold across frozen fields, Rafn stood once again by the fjord's edge. The water lay still, reflecting the vast sky like polished glass. The iron ring hung heavy on his neck, yet it felt less like a shackle now and more like a mark of a journey, one that was far from over. Kettle joined him, his steps slow but steady. The old man rested a hand on his son's shoulder, a silent gesture laden with years of unspoken love and shared struggle. "You have carried us through shadow, Rafn," Kettle said softly, his breath misting in the cold air. "Not just your own fate, but the fate of many who had forgotten how to hope." Rafn's gaze lingered on the horizon where the fjord met the sky, the endless expanse both daunting and full of promise. "The road ahead is still uncertain," he replied, voice steady. "But now it is ours to walk, not as thralls or masters, but as men bound by truth and choice." Thyra approached quietly, her fiery hair catching the morning light. In her hands, she carried a small bundle wrapped in leather, a gift forged in the smithy's fire and shaped by her own steady hands. It was a simple iron pendant, etched with the symbol of Freya, a beacon of love and courage. "For protection," she said, offering it to Rafn, "and a reminder that even in dark times, the gods watch over those who fight for what is right." He accepted the pendant, the cool metal pressing against his palm, a tangible link between past and future, between chains and freedom. The village gathered soon after for a quiet ceremony beneath the ancient oak at the heart of Ravenholm. The tree's gnarled branches stretched wide, a living testament to the cycles of life, death, and renewal. Here, the people set down old grievances and took tentative steps toward healing. Rafn stood before the crowd, no longer a thrall but a voice rising from the depths of hardship. He spoke not of anger or revenge, but of the bonds that held them all, thrall and free, old and young, strong and broken. "Chains may bind our bodies," he said, voice clear and unwavering, "but they cannot bind our hearts or our honor. We are all children of these lands and of the gods who watch over us. Let us choose courage and truth, not fear, as the legacy we leave behind." The crowd listened, a silence folding over them like a cloak. In that moment, something shifted, a collective breath drawn in hope. Erica stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "I am no longer a shadow to fear. Here, I have found a place to stand, and I vow to walk with all who seek justice and peace." Thyra's eyes gleamed with pride as she clasped her hands together. Even the elders nodded, their faces softened by decades of hardened tradition bending, just a little. Thorvald watched from the edge of the gathering, his figure imposing yet less distant. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of both command and concession. "Ravenholm will endure not because of strength alone, but because of the unity we forge from our trials. Let this day mark a new chapter, where the bonds we share are stronger than any chain." As the sun climbed higher, casting light over the village and fjord, the corvids soared above, no longer harbingers of doom, but watchers of a dawn born from struggle and hope. Rafn looked upward, a quiet smile touching his lips. The iron ring glinted faintly in the sunlight, but his spirit was unshackled, free to soar beyond the limits of his past. In Ravenholm, among the rugged fjords and whispering winds, a new story had begun, one of courage, redemption, and the unyielding power of truth. And though the road ahead would hold its own shadows, the flame of hope burned steady, lighting the way for all who dared to walk it. The long night began to yield to dawn, the first pale fingers of light tracing fragile patterns across the frost-covered earth. The village of Ravenholm lay still, caught between the quiet that comes before a storm and the fragile hope that follows hardship. Rafn lay beside his father on the thin mat of straw, every breath a slow rhythm against the weight of pain that still lingered across his back. The 30 lashes had left their mark, raw lines like jagged rivers across his skin, yet beneath the ache lay a steadiness born of conviction. Kettle's frail chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but his eyes, clouded with age and weariness, now held a glimmer of peace. The burden of false accusation had been lifted, and with it, a weight that had pressed heavily on both their souls. The old man's hand found Rafn's, fingers trembling but steady, a silent thank you unspoken but deeply felt. Outside, the cold wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks, carrying the soft caws of circling corvids. They were no longer ominous messengers of doom, but watchers of a dawn reborn, a signal that even in a world carved by ice and steel, change could take root. Rafn's gaze drifted toward the small window, where the light grew stronger, casting the cabin's rough timber walls in a pale glow. Tomorrow, the village would stir again. The Jarl would resume his place of command, and the old ways would press hard against the fragile threads of transformation. But something fundamental had shifted. The chains that bound Rafn's body remained, iron cold and unyielding, yet the invisible chains that had once shackled his spirit had begun to crumble. He recalled the moment in the great hall, standing face to face with the Jarl, words sharp and unwavering despite the fear curling in his gut. The courage it took to speak truth to power, to risk everything for honor and justice. Those memories warmed him now, like embers glowing beneath cold ash. Thyra's voice, steady and fearless, had pierced the silence, unraveling the web of lies that had ensnared his father. And then, the confession, the bitter words from Gunnar Maudifero, a man whose greed had poisoned the village's trust. His execution had been swift, a grim but necessary reckoning. The sight of his body hanging at the gates was a dark warning, a stark reminder that betrayal carried a heavy price. Yet, in the shadow of that grim justice, Ravenholm began to breathe again. The villagers' eyes, once clouded with suspicion and fear, now carried tentative respect for the thrall who had dared to stand. The walls of the great hall seemed less forbidding, the voices within no longer steeped solely in command, but beginning to carry whispers of fairness and hope. Rafn's thoughts turned to Thyra, her fiery hair and fierce green eyes a beacon in the bleak landscape of his life. Without her courage and steadfastness, his own resolve might have faltered. Together, they had kindled a small flame of rebellion, not through weapons or bloodshed, but through truth and solidarity. Her presence beside him was a reminder that even in a world divided by chains and caste, alliances could form and hearts could be won. Erica, too, was a symbol of that fragile hope. The wild girl with haunted eyes, once trembling beneath the weight of abandonment, had found sanctuary in their small cabin. Her scars, both visible and hidden, told stories of pain and survival that few dared to hear. But now, she walked more confidently through the village's shadowed paths, a quiet testament to the possibility of healing. The days that followed were not easy. The frost lingered stubbornly over the earth, and the winds cut sharper as winter pressed in. Old resentments simmered beneath the surface, and the memory of Rafn's defiance haunted the halls like a restless spirit. The Jarl's rule remained firm, his voice still commanding respect and obedience. Yet, even his steely gaze held traces of the grudging respect forged in the fires of confrontation. Rafn often found himself alone at the fjord's edge, staring into the endless waters that stretched beyond the village. The iron ring at his neck was heavy, a constant reminder of his status as thrall. But in his heart, the weight felt lighter. Freedom, he had learned, was more than the absence of chains. It was the courage to carry one's truth in spite of them. Kettle's voice echoed beside him, steady and weathered by time. You have changed more than your own fate, son. You have changed how we see ourselves and each other. Rafn nodded, the cold wind tugging at his dark hair. Chains bind the body, but not the spirit, he replied softly. Even a thrall can choose to. Erica stepped forward, her voice trembling yet determined. I am no longer a shadow to be feared. Here, I have found a place to stand, and I vow to walk with all who seek justice and peace. The gathering held its breath. Even the stern elders nodded, the heavy weight of tradition softened by the possibility of change. Thorvald's voice, when it came, was quiet but resolute. Ravenholm will endure not because of strength alone, but because of the unity we forge from our trials. Let this day mark a new chapter, where the bonds we share are stronger than any chain. The corvids soared overhead, black wings tracing ancient patterns against the sky, no longer harbingers of doom, but watchers of a new dawn. Their cries echoed as a haunting melody, a reminder that from darkness can come light. Rafn smiled faintly, the iron ring still heavy at his neck, but no longer a shackle. His spirit was unbound, soaring beyond the limits imposed by birth or circumstance. The road ahead was uncertain, winding through shadows and light alike. But he would walk it with eyes open and heart unyielding. In Ravenholm, amidst the rugged fjords and whispering winds, a new story was being told. A story not of chains or silence, but of courage, dignity, and the unbreakable power of truth. And as the village stirred beneath the rising sun, Rafn knew this was but the first step. The flame of hope burned steady, not with the roar of battle, but with the quiet promise of freedom carried in the hearts of those brave enough to seek it. For even a thrall, bound by iron and suffering, can choose to be free. And in that choice lies a strength no chain can conquer. If this story has stirred your soul, if the courage of a single thrall has awakened a spark within, join us. Subscribe, share, and walk with us through the shadows and light of Viking history, where every life tells a tale of honor and hope. Because sometimes, the fiercest battles are not fought with sword and shield, but with the quiet fire of truth. And that fire burns in us all.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.